Friends, thank you for being here today. We're living in an era where the geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting beneath our feet, not by inches, but by miles. The rules-based international order, that invisible architecture that has prevented a third world war and guaranteed the sovereignty of free nations for 78 years, is not just fracturing right now. In some corridors of power, it is being actively dismantled. Today, we are going to dive into a terrifyingly realistic, highly classified geopolitical wargame that recently leaked from elite think tanks, and has since set deep web political forums completely ablaze. If you travel in intelligence and diplomatic circles, you'll hear this simulation referred to ominously as Operation Northern Silence. I need to be absolutely clear right from the start. What I am about to describe to you is a hypothetical simulation. It is a thought experiment, a stress test designed by political analysts to model the absolute worst-case scenario for transatlantic alliances. But the reason this specific wargame is keeping Ottawa insiders, European diplomats, and international relations scholars awake at night is because every single ingredient required for this fiction to become reality already exists in our world right now. The premise of this viral simulation asks a question that strikes at the very heart of the modern democratic world. Think about it. What actually happens when the leader of the free world decides that the word ally is just a polite synonym for subordinate? What happens when the United States of America, wielding the most powerful economic and military engine in human history, decides that the sovereign elections of its closest neighbors are subject to an executive veto from Washington? Before we get into the terrifying timeline of this wargame, I want to hear from you. Do you believe the Free World Alliance is actually cracking right now? Or is this just standard political theater? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I read every single one, and this is a debate we need to be having. In this hypothetical crisis, the 78-year post-war transatlantic alliance faces its ultimate fatal stress test. The simulation models a scenario where an American president completely bypasses all diplomatic norms, discards decades of mutual respect, and explicitly demands the immediate, unconditional resignation of a newly elected, highly competent G7 leader. That leader is Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. If you are Canadian, if you are a defender of democratic integrity, or if you simply believe that free nations should not be treated as imperial vassal states, the implications of this wargame are blood-chilling. The fundamental question Operation Northern Silence poses is a dark one. If the world's most powerful nation decides it possesses the unilateral right to hire and fire the democratically elected heads of sovereign allied democracies, does the free world actually still exist? Or have we quietly entered an era of democratic expansionism where freedom is only permitted so long as it aligns with American corporate and political whims? To really grasp why this hypothetical scenario feels so dangerously, palpably plausible today, we need to step out of the simulation for a moment and look at the real-world players involved. Because this isn't just a clash of nations, it's a profound collision of intellect, philosophy, and temperament. It's a David versus Goliath narrative where institutional brilliance faces off against raw, unchecked transactional impulse. Let's start by looking at the man holding the line in Ottawa. We are talking about Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Let's be clear about the reality of who he is. This is not some career politician who can be easily intimidated by loud voices or bluster. Carney is, without exaggeration, arguably the most qualified economic mind to lead a G7 nation in the last 3 decades. We are talking about a man with a pedigree forged in the fires of global crises. When the 2008 financial meltdown brought the global economy to its knees, it was Carney, at the helm of the Bank of Canada, who steered the nation through the catastrophe so masterfully that Canada was the only G7 country to retain its pristine AA credit rating throughout the entire crisis. And he didn't stop there. He was drafted to lead the Bank of England, guiding the British economy through the unprecedented volatility of Brexit, earning bipartisan respect for his cold, calculating, and steady hand. With degrees from Harvard and Oxford, Carney represents the ultimate adult in the room. In the real world today, as Prime Minister, he is actively championing strategic autonomy for Canada, recognizing that a nation cannot survive if its economic heartbeat is entirely dependent on the fluctuating moods of a neighbor. He is an intellectual heavyweight who understands global markets better than almost anyone alive. Then, sitting in the Oval Office, you have the exact polar opposite. Contrast Carney's measured, data-driven worldview with the real-world reality of Donald Trump and the America First doctrine. Trump views global alliances not as shared values or historical brotherhoods, but as purely transactional, almost mob-style protection rackets. We have seen his historic weaponization of tariffs against Canada. We have witnessed his profound disdain for the traditional, rules-based international order. For the Trump administration, a good deal is only one where America dominates and the other party suffers. So, the wargame asks the inevitable question: what happens when these two forces collide? What happens when Trump's insatiable demand for total North American economic submission meets Carney's ironclad, unyielding defense of Canadian economic sovereignty? The authors of the Northern Silence simulation mapped out exactly how this plays out, and they scripted a timeline that moves with the terrifying speed of a ticking clock political thriller. Their methodology for breaking down the alliance is chillingly methodical. It all starts with something that sounds incredibly dry, but is actually the lifeblood of national sovereignty, monetary policy. In the scenario, Prime Minister Carney, acting on his mandate, implements a uniquely Canadian financial strategy. To combat skyrocketing, crisis-level housing inflation in domestic markets like Vancouver and Toronto, the simulation projects Carney keeping Canadian interest rates elevated. Crucially, he refuses to sync this policy with the United States Federal Reserve, which, in the wargame, is slashing rates to artificially stimulate the American market ahead of midterms. According to the simulation's detailed timeline, this simple assertion of Canadian financial independence triggers an absolute eruption in the Oval Office. The wargame outlines a hypothetical, leaked closed-door cabinet meeting occurring precisely at 2:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. In this simulated meeting, Trump views Carney's independent monetary policy not as a sovereign right, but as an act of economic treason against the unified North American market. The authors of the wargame provide a hypothetical quote from the American president in that room that sets the tone for everything to follow. We own their market, and they need to remember that. If they don't play ball, we break the bat. From there, the conflict explodes into public warfare. The script dictates that at 6:47 a.m. the following Thursday, Trump fires off a massive broadside on Truth Social. In this hypothetical post, Trump publicly attacks Carney, declaring that his high interest rates are destroying the North American economic miracle. He demands that someone who actually understands economics and respects America take over in Ottawa, threatening that the United States will not stand idly by and watch market suicide on its northern border. The simulation projects this post, garnering millions of interactions within hours, whipping up a frenzy of anti-Canadian sentiment across right-wing media networks. But the true climax of the setup, the moment this wargame shifts from standard diplomatic friction to an existential crisis for global democracy, arrives on Friday morning. The scenario zeroes in on a hypothetical, unannounced phone call placed from the Oval Office to the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa at exactly 9:07 a.m. According to the wargame's parameters, this call lasts exactly 14 minutes and 31 seconds. There is no small talk. There is no diplomatic preamble. In this simulated exchange, Trump explicitly, unequivocally demands that Mark Carney step down from his position as Prime Minister of Canada within 48 hours. If Carney refuses to allow a more cooperative administration to take the reins, Trump threatens to execute crippling, unprecedented, and total economic blockades. We're talking tariffs on every single Canadian export, the freezing of cross-border assets, and the immediate suspension of the USMCA. It's a punishment so severe, it would fundamentally and permanently sever US-Canada relations and plunge the Canadian economy into an immediate depression. Just let that hypothetical sink in for a second. An American president issuing a 48-hour ultimatum for the resignation of a fellow G7 leader. I want you to pause this video right here for a second. Put yourself in the Prime Minister's shoes. You have 48 hours. The most powerful economy on earth is threatening to crush your country if you don't step down. What is your exact next move? Would you call their bluff, or would you try to negotiate? Let me know what you would do down in the comments. So, the clock is ticking. The question the simulation asks next is the one that really matters. How does a sovereign nation react to blatant, unchecked extortion? This is where the Northern Silence simulation outlines a response that will make any Canadian's blood pump with absolute fierce pride. In this wargame, Canada does not bend. The Maple Leaf roars. The simulation details an immediate, frantic, and highly aggressive Canadian counteroffensive, starting right on the tarmac. At 11:42 a.m., just hours after the ultimatum, a Canadian government jet rockets out of Ottawa, carrying the Canadian Foreign Minister directly to Joint Base Andrews. The wargame scripts a tense 1 hour and 23-minute closed-door showdown at the U.S. State Department. The Canadian delegation doesn't come to negotiate. They come to deliver the sharpest peacetime message in the history of the continent. The hypothetical message rests on three unyielding pillars. First, Canada views the demand as an unprecedented infringement on democratic sovereignty. Second, Canada will not alter its monetary policy by 0.01% under threat. Third, if the U.S. executes its economic blockade, Canada will instantly retaliate and, more importantly, will drag the United States in front of the United Nations, NATO, and the G7, publicly exposing America as a rogue actor bullying its own allies. The Canadian Foreign Minister leaves the American Secretary of State with a chilling final thought. Washington does not pick Canada's government. But the simulation reserves its most triumphant, spine-tingling moment for Ottawa itself. At 3:34 p.m. in the wargame timeline, Prime Minister Mark Carney addresses the Canadian House of Commons in an emergency broadcast transmitted live across the globe. Standing at the lectern, the wargame authors script a soaring Churchillian speech for Carney. Imagine the scene as he looks directly into the cameras, addressing not just Canadians, but the world, and most directly, the Oval Office. The hypothetical quote provided in the wargame is a masterclass in Defiant statecraft. I was elected by the Canadian people with a clear, undeniable mandate. The government of this nation is decided by the ballots cast in Montreal, in Calgary, in Halifax, and in Vancouver, not by executive orders drafted in foreign capitals. We are an independent, sovereign nation. We will not surrender our economic independence, nor our democratic soul, to threats, extortion, or ultimatums from any foreign power, no matter how powerful they believe themselves to be. Canada bows to no one. The wargame projects that, upon finishing this speech, domestic political divisions in Canada instantly vaporize. The Conservative opposition, which fiercely debates Carney on every domestic policy, releases a joint statement standing shoulder to shoulder with the Liberal Prime Minister. The message sent to Washington is impenetrable. We may fight internally, but against foreign subjugation, we are one wall of ice and stone. As the day closes in the simulation, the global dominoes immediately begin to fall. By nightfall, the wargame shows the European Union and the United Kingdom issuing emergency, highly aggressive statements backing Canada completely. They condemn the U.S. actions as unacceptable democratic expansionism. Suddenly, in this hypothetical scenario, it is not Canada that is isolated, it is the United States standing alone, having shattered the trust of the entire democratic world. Before we leave the confines of this simulation, we have to answer the most terrifying question of all. How does the wargame actually end? The analysts who drafted Operation Northern Silence didn't just leave us with a dramatic cliffhanger. They modeled 3 distinct data-driven outcomes based on this intense geopolitical standoff. And I need to warn you, none of them result in the world magically going back to normal. Let's break them down. Scenario 1 is what the analysts call the tactical retreat. They give this about a 20% probability. In this outcome, faced with a unified wall of Canadian defiance, immediate public blowback from the European Union, and quiet internal panic from Wall Street and American border state governors, the Oval Office blinks. But they don't apologize. Instead, the administration spins the 14-minute call as a misunderstanding or simply a tough negotiating tactic that the media blew completely out of proportion. Carney stays in power, the tariffs are paused, and the immediate crisis fades from the headlines. But here's the kicker, even in this best-case scenario, the damage is absolutely irreversible. Every Democratic ally now knows, unequivocally, that the American president believes he has the intrinsic right to demand their resignation. The psychological foundation of the transatlantic alliance is permanently cracked. Scenario 2 is the economic war of attrition. The simulation assigns this a 45% probability, making it the most likely outcome. Trump, refusing to look weak after issuing a public ultimatum, doubles down and signs the executive order. Crippling tariffs slam into Canadian steel, aluminum, and timber. Canada immediately counters, unleashing a meticulously drafted retaliation package targeting politically sensitive U.S. agricultural exports in states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Overnight, the highly integrated North American supply chain hemorrhages. U.S. manufacturers who rely heavily on Canadian materials face catastrophic delays and layoffs. Canadian consumers face skyrocketing prices on imported goods. The economic pain is mutual, widespread, and devastating. Eventually, after months of mutual destruction and screaming constituents on both sides of the border, a messy, face-saving ceasefire is brokered. But the U.S.-Canada relationship is poisoned for a generation, reduced to nothing more than bitter, hostile neighbors sharing a heavily militarized economic fence. Then there is Scenario 3. The wargame ominously calls this the alliance fracture, assigning it a terrifying 35% probability. This is the nightmare result that should chill anyone who understands how the post-war order operates. In this projection, Canada does not back down, and neither does the U.S. The economic blockade holds firm, but Canada goes nuclear on the diplomatic front. They invoke Article 2 of the UN Charter on Sovereign Equality. The upcoming NATO summit is completely hijacked by the crisis. Instead of focusing on containing Russia or managing the Indo-Pacific theater, European allies openly question whether a coalition led by a nation that actively blackmails its own members can be trusted with collective security. The fracture isn't cinematic or explosive, it's a slow, grinding, irreversible divorce. The United States doesn't lose its superpower status militarily, but it entirely loses its moral authority. American leadership of the free world essentially evaporates, leaving a massive power vacuum that authoritarian regimes in Beijing and Moscow eagerly rush in to fill. All right, let's take a quick poll. Which of those three scenarios, the tactical retreat, the economic war, or the alliance fracture, do you think is the most realistic outcome if this happened today? Type 1, 2, or 3 in the comments right now and tell me why you chose it. But let's pause the simulation for a second. Let's pull back the curtain and look at the cold, hard reality of where we actually stand today in March 2026. Why are we discussing a war game? Why is this specific simulation going viral right now among the most elite political analysts on the planet? It's because, friends, the line between this fiction and our current reality is razor thin, and it is shrinking every single day. While the 14-minute call and the explicit 48-hour resignation demand are a constructed thought experiment, the toxic elements surrounding it are entirely, demonstrably real. The economic bullying, the casual threats of devastating tariffs to force political concessions, the blatant disregard for allied sovereignty. These are not hypothetical. They are happening right now, out in the open. There's a profound danger of normalization occurring before our very eyes. The Northern Silence scenario is not meant to entertain. It is a desperate warning about what happens if we allow the guardrails of democratic respect to erode. We are the frog in the boiling water. If we accept the premise that the United States can use its economic gravity to dictate domestic policy to Ottawa, then the infection spreads. Mexico is next, then the United Kingdom, then the European Union. Slowly but surely, the concept of sovereignty becomes an illusion, and global democracy becomes nothing more than a theater production subservient to American executive whims. This entire scenario is a stark call to vigilance. Maintaining sovereignty in the 21st century isn't just about military defense and patrolling borders anymore. It is about economic resilience. It is about possessing the political backbone to say no, when saying yes is easier but ultimately fatal. This is precisely why we are seeing real-world efforts by leaders like Mark Carney to urgently build new alliances outside the shadow of the United States. When you see Canada making unprecedented trade overtures to Australia or deepening strategic ties with India and the Indo-Pacific, understand that this is not just routine trade policy. It is a calculated, desperate defense mechanism. It is Ottawa recognizing that being solely tethered to an unpredictable transactional superpower is an existential vulnerability. They are trying to diversify Canada's economic lifeline so that if a Northern Silence scenario ever bleeds from fiction into reality, Canada has the leverage to survive the blockade. As we wrap up this analysis, I want to turn the final question over to you. This scenario, Operation Northern Silence, was a simulation, a war game, a viral what if. But I ask you, how far away from it are we, really? Look at the rhetoric. Look at the current political climate. If this hypothetical crisis happened tomorrow, if the phone rang in Ottawa and the ultimatum was delivered, would Canada hold the line as the war game predicts? Would the unified wall of ice and stone hold fast? Or would the sheer, crushing weight of American economic pressure force a collapse, leading to the quiet, unceremonious death of Canadian sovereignty? I want to hear your thoughts. Debate this down in the comments. Share this video with anyone who cares about the future of global alliances. And make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss our next deep dive. The future of democratic integrity depends on our willingness to confront these uncomfortable, terrifying possibilities before they become our reality. Thank you for watching. Keep your eyes open, and I will see you in the next one.